It's my pleasure now to introduce Ken Loach. As you must have noticed, we've never done this before, and so there's a kind of slight change of script. We were supposed to meet him outside, now he's here, so we have to kind of improvise a little bit.
I have a first question. Actually, the 1965 Up the Junction is a story of 3 young working class women in Clapham, and was one of your earliest movies, and one of the few times actually you've worked in the metropolis in London. I wanted to ask you why you seem to prefer in Northern England instead of working in London, and if there are kind of a certain set of professional difficulties in terms of filming in London.
Yes, I think they are. There are. Hello, anyway. And we met in surreal circumstances in Tokyo.
Let's not go into them.
A few years ago. Yes. Well, I've always found it easier to work in communities that are quite compact, and London is quite big and amorphous. And when you're, for example, finding people to be in films, when the area and the community is quite circumscribed, it's easier to, it's much tighter, so you don't have such a big choice. So it's easier. To find people in London, it's a real needle in a haystack. So it's then, because the choice is so huge, it's therefore more difficult. But I always work with a writer, and where the writer writes and the idiom the writer writes in is always critical. So, for example, I've been working with a Scottish writer, so we've been working in Glasgow, and before that I worked with a writer from South Yorkshire, so we worked a lot in South Yorkshire.
And can you maybe tell us a little bit about this very early Up the Junction, which happened in London?
Yes, it was a book written by a writer called Nell Dunn, who is a very fine writer, and she lived for a time in Battersea, and the book is little vignettes, little incidents, anecdotes of this group of people, and they're partly funny and they're partly sad, and the anecdotes all put together make a kind of mosaic, make a picture of life of the time, which was the mid-1960s. Not quite swinging London of cliche, really, but rather tougher than that.
I think there's an interesting thing about your career. You're incredibly consistent, and yet you're successful. Can you comment on that? Were there times that you thought that your consistency would undo you?
Yes. Well, I hope by consistent you don't mean repetitious, but I take it in its most favourable light.
Yeah.
I think that I suppose you work, or you try to work according to the way you see the world, and you try to tell stories and relationships and descriptions that fit one's view of the world, whatever it is, and you try to articulate that, and you try to work it out in conjunction with the writers. And so there's always the biggest question is what film shall we do next? What story shall we do next? And that's something you discuss a lot and argue about and consider. And I suppose, if you try to reflect a consistent view, then there will be that consistency. I hope so. But it should be sometimes surprising at the time, but then maybe consistent in retrospect.
Your most recent film is a kind of historical film, and of course your perspective kind of remains kind of very critical of England, leftist perspective. At the same time, there are currently kind of issues in the world that are so unbelievably urgent and drastic. You address them in many letters, and there's no doubting your involvement in the kind of current events. But how do you explain the kind of preoccupation with such a historical subject at the moment that the world seems to be going up in flames?
Well, I mean, as you say, the world does seem to be going up in flames, and it's an alarming time.
Huh?
The Irish story is one we'd wanted to tell for many years, because the events we try to describe are really a classic story of an imperial power removing itself, or being forced to remove itself from its colony, but nevertheless doing everything it can to safeguard its interests, and in the process screwing up the people that it's apparently granting independence to, screwing it up so that there's been trouble in the north of that country for the last 80 years. But I hope it says something about what happens to an army of occupation when it's surrounded by a civilian population which doesn't want it. It says something about empire. It says something about resistance and the divisions that can be hidden when there is a common enemy, but which come to the fore once that common enemy is no longer there. I mean, all of which have something reflecting in some way.
Resonance.
Yes, with a resonance with what's going on now.
I had the privilege to be the neighbor of Lindsay Anderson for a long time. And looking at your work, there is something quintessentially English about that work, and also an enormous preoccupation with English issues. How does the fact that England is now, let's say, unrecognizable from the England 15 years ago, how does that affect your work and your subjects?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, it's superficially. I mean, I think it is quite different.
Yeah.
Essentially, I think it's very similar. I mean, we are very used to, for example, leaders of the Labour Party who are voted in as left-wingers and who become intensely men of the right. I mean, this is a familiar pattern that stretches back for the last century, for example. But in other respects, you're right, it is very different. I mean, the drive to privatization has transformed the way our society is organized. And I was interested to listen to Tim, and I was waiting for him to talk about the privatization of the tube or the return to public ownership, and I don't think he talked about it, and I was quite sad about that, really.
Well, we didn't ask about it.
Right, well, there was opportunity. But I mean, the landscape does change, but in a sense, the skeleton underneath is the same, I think.
But is a filmmaker about the skeleton or about the landscape?
Well, about both. Because if you don't know the bones underneath, you don't know which bits are important, really. I think the structure of society tells you how to evaluate the events you see around you.
But for instance, if I were a filmmaker in England, I would be kind of absolutely fascinated by the coexistence of Muslim world, radicalization, etc. Is that something where we could ever imagine you doing a movie?
I did one actually, Rem. A couple of years ago. It was called A Fond Kiss, and it was about a Pakistani a family in the Pakistani community in Glasgow, and the young man is a DJ. He's very contemporary. He has one foot in the modern Western world and one foot in the traditional world, and it was about his situation, and he has a relationship with an Irish girl who is in fact an immigrant to Scotland, while he is in fact native, but he is treated as an immigrant, and of course she is, because she's white, is treated as not. So it's about the situation of that second generation family, and was very, very interesting, very extraordinary subject to explore, really.
I think it's interesting also that Rem's question leads us also to a question maybe sort of larger about the present, sort of the present moment, and your work. And I was wondering that, I mean, at this moment of kind of a lot of unrest and mass demonstration, if you think about big anti-war demonstration here, which still resonates, there's obviously a certain, it's reminiscent, makes us think of the 60s, and it's sort of your methods of cinema, they seem somehow very apt for that sort of Bush-Blair moment right now. So I was somehow wondering if you were tempted to turn your lens to the present.
Well, I think it is very tempting, but I think in a way it's, I mean, if you do fiction, then you want to reflect on the way the world is and reflect that or refract those ideas through character and through character development and relationships. I mean, the way that would be fascinating to deal with the present is through documentary.
Yeah.
And that is very tempting. I mean, it's it's something that we've talked about doing. But the world is changing so fast. I mean, you know, who would have believed that we would be sitting, listening to our Prime Minister to just say, in effect, carry on bombing, carry on killing, you know? I mean, who would have believed we would listen to that? Who would have believed we'd be selling arms to like pouring petrol on the flames? It's just, it's unbelievable. So keeping up with the treachery would be one of the problems in a documentary now.
Another question I wanted to ask you is about we spoke about lots of your realized films, about realized projects. I was wondering the whole sort of unrealized cinema, and I was somehow wondering if you had any kind of unrealized projects coming to your mind which you'd like to see to happen.
Well, stacks really, but they still might happen one day. I mean, we've been wanting to make the Irish film for nearly 30 years. I had, and finally, you know, working with Paul Laverty, we managed to do it. But we tried it a couple of times. We were once turned down by Channel 4 to do, you know, virtually a similar story to this, because the director at the time, Jeremy Isaacs, turned us down. He said he didn't want to import Sam Peckinpah into the politics of Northern Ireland, which I thought was a little ungenerous of him, really. But no, I mean, there are others, there are lots, but they're kind of tucked away in the drawer, you know, and they might reappear one day.
And I had a question about improvisation, because, I mean, Rem and I have been sort of preparing for days here a certain script for this marathon, yet there is a kind of a quite big space for improvisation. So I was wondering what kind of emphasis you put on improvisation. I read in some cinema magazines that you are actually very often not giving actors the entire script. So I was very curious to hear more about that.
No, well, I mean, in the end, the only thing that matters is what you see on the screen. I mean, it's like asking you about the mechanism for constructing this really nice pavilion. I mean, the main thing is it's a really nice pavilion, you know, and the mechanism is secondary. But no, I mean, I think one of the things we try and do in a film is that when you watch it, you have the impression that really these things are really just happening. And so, how do you do that? One part of the method is that we shoot in sequence, and then take the actors and the cast through the events, so that they know everything about themselves, and they know everything about who they are in the film, but they don't know what the acts of God will be in the course of the story, so that when a surprise happens, it is a surprise. And we try to find actors who will, as they reveal themselves, will reveal something about the character they're playing in the film. So for that reason, we hold back some of the story, you know, till and it keeps it alive, you know. And maybe some people are going to die, and they usually run in a book on who's going to face death before the end of the film, and it keeps a kind of certain tension in the process, which can be quite creative, really.
What globalization has a kind of huge effect in films. There is a kind of particular kind of film that is global, but without particular features. what has been its effect on you or on your conception of movie making? And I also would like to ask,
Yes.
are there kind of particular influences that are less than self-evident that you could talk about?
Yes, I mean there are. I mean everybody always has influences, particularly when you're growing up and when you're forming your ideas. And the things that influenced me were the cinema influences were like the obvious ones, I guess, the Italian neorealists and like the French filmmaker Robert Bresson and the Czech filmmakers of the 60s. But the other things that I think were very much part of the culture as I was growing up was the music hall, you know, the variety comedians, the names that probably won't mean very much now to people under 50, but the comics of the time, people like George Formby or Frank Randall, or you know the kind of raucous working class comics that we used to go and see in the 40s and 50s, and the theatre director called Joan Littlewood, who was one of the most creative people that I think have ever worked in the theatre, and had this brilliant theatre in East London, Stratford East, which was, as she described it, a palace of fun.
With Cedric Price was the project she had with Cedric Price, not a fun palace.
Yes, and I mean, very big influence on all of us. But I think those were the main things.
But I think that one of the strong effects of globalization is that it doesn't seem to enable somebody to stay with a particular identity or a particular mentality or a particular sophistication, but it forces every one of us to constantly adjust. Does it have the same effect on you or on your way of making films?
Not really. Perhaps it should, but it hasn't. I mean, I suppose we experience globalization in the cinema, in the fact that most of the cinemas that we all go to, the multiplexes, have a very standardized product. I mean, it's always referred to as product rather dismally, which I would find rather depressing, but it's seen as product, and it tends to be rather standardized, and it's aimed at the global market. But there is a strong European film culture which is supported particularly by the French and by the Italians and by the Spanish and sometimes by the Germans, so that the protection of that cinema identity is seen as very important. Sure. And we've, you know, and other filmmakers from here have got support from those audiences.
From that,
yes.
Sure.
So that's been a big, not much from Britain, I have to say.
Yeah.
I mean, we tend to produce bureaucracies, but we don't actually do much. But the French put their money where their mouth is.
Maybe it's interesting towards the end of the conversation to bring it back to London, because I mean one of the ideas of this marathon is to kind of have an idea somehow, or have different sort of views on London, and we were very much wondering how you see London now, and if you had any kind of dreams for London.
Well, I've been the last few days getting the North London line. I don't know if anyone else here gets it. The North London line that goes from my bit in NW5 round to Stratford and through Hackney, Homerton, Dalston and the rest round to the docks. And when you go on that line, you do see the backside of London a lot of the time. And you realise the vast expanses of the city that are really just battered and left and sad in some ways, and wonderful buildings caught in isolation. And I mean, what would be a great vision for the city would be to really regenerate it from the backside in, rather than always starting in the centre, but to really, really clean that part and to cherish the good things that are there, and to bring the inspiration of new architecture to those parts of the city that you just see when you travel on line and other lines like it, because I think that the truth of the city is often seen on those railway lines that go around the edge of the city, rather more than in the set pieces in the centre. And I think it's those areas that we could really polish up and cherish and renew.
Great. Many, many thanks to Ken Loach. Thank you very much.
Thank you.